In this lesson, we're going to look at a few more advanced PowerShell concepts. I want to go back to the aliases I talked about in the previous lesson. Remember I said that commands such as dir would work. But remember what's actually happening behind the scenes is this is just an alias to the getChildItem. This is an example of an alias to an intrinsic command of command.exe or the command prompt, so an internal command. There is no dir.exe, it is just part of the command shell. So normally, I could say dir/s. S is a switch of dir. And that works, it's going to go through every single subfolder. Let's try that in PowerShell. That does not work. The reason is getChildItem has no such thing as a /s switch. So I have to be very careful when I'm using these aliases because although it may appear to work, when I try and use various parameters, the reality is it is not calling dir from a command prompt. It's using the getChildItem that does have different parameters. Now, if it was an external command, for example, something like ipconfig is an actual command. If I go into Windows, there's an actual executable, and that has a number of switches. So from PowerShell, it's actually calling that executable, which means all the same switches would work. So you have to understand the difference between those intrinsic and those external commands for how those switches are going to work, which is why it really is always better to use the PowerShell commandlet rather than relying on those aliases. So I have a lot of capability with PowerShell. For example, I can say, get me all the processes. Now I could do something very similar with the command prompt. I could dump out the list of processes from command.exe with the task list command. So if I go in here, I can see a very similar set of output. But the difference is the command prompt is giving these out as bunches of text strings. What happens in PowerShell is these are kept as objects. So for example, what it's actually passing me back here are instances of objects of a type process. So here it's actually formatting this as a table. So I can actually say format table, which is the default of what it's doing. But I can also say, well, actually show me these objects as a list instead. I could make it show me as XML format. These are being kept as objects. And the important part is because they're being kept as objects, I can pass them through to other commands. So let's take a different example. Let's see all of my virtual machines. So it's going to show me all the VMs on this box. Well, I might now say, well, okay, they're all my virtual machines. Now, for example, maybe I want to see all my hard disks related to that. So I'd say get VM and then get VM hard disk drive. So it's going to pass the name of each of those VMs, those actual virtual machine objects, into the get VM hard disk drive commandlet. So it's not just passing a string, it's actually passing the VM object through. So then for each of those VMs, it can then find each of the hard disk drives used by those virtual machines. So this is basically chaining or piping objects from one command to another command. I could then pass this through even further. For example, maybe in that same command, I want to only show the ones where path is that e virtuals sav, for example. I don't want to see the ones that are stored on an SMB file share, or that don't start with sav. So now what I can do is I can actually pass that through and do tests. So I could say where. Now I need to look at the object that is being passed to me. So to actually look at a attribute of an object, we use the $_. And now I can look at any of the attributes for each object. So I want to look at the path attribute. So $_ represents the object being passed to me. And a dot now says, well, let me see a particular attribute. So I want to look at the path. And I want to see if it starts with, so this is now using string functions. Does it start with e:virtuals sav, for example? So instead of now showing me everything, it will only show me those that actually start with e:virtual, so it took those out. So I can actually access the individual attributes of those objects being passed to me. Then I can perform actions on them. So the next thing I may want to do is I found all the ones on that file system. Maybe I want to move them. So I could then say for each of those objects, so for each object, move it. So I want to move the VM storage, and the VM name is that underscore VM name it just passed me. So I can see that column represents the attribute. So there's an attribute called VM name. So for each of those objects that are being passed through this chain, so for that VM name, I want to say the destination is maybe equal to E colon, just as an example. And then I'm going to use what if. This is a fantastic capability. It allows me to show what would happen without actually performing the action. So if ever you're doing any testing, what if is a great thing to use to see, well, what would happen if I was to run this PowerShell command? So by adding that what if within this command, it's telling me what it would have done without actually doing it. So look at the objects I passed through. GetVM gave me a list of all the virtual machines as virtual machine objects, which were passed to the GetVM hard disk drive, which then showed me all the hard disk drive objects for the VMs passed to me. I then did a test for those virtual hard disk objects, which of them had a path that started with E colon virtuals. Those objects were then passed to this next command, which for each object it was passed, it ran this command, moved the storage, and then what if, to say, well, don't really do this, but just tell me what would have happened. I can also do -confirm. So instead of it actually not doing the action, it will prompt me before actually performing the action. This is a fantastic capability. The ability to pipe the objects from one PowerShell commandlet to another, which can then perform actions on them, keeping it as an object rather than some text string, allows me to access the attributes, access the functions of those objects. I can do tests, I can use the what if, I can use confirm. So it gives me a lot of flexibility in how I go about using this and managing my PowerShell environment. And this ability to pass the objects is huge. For example, I may do a get process, for example, do a test on if its name, is Notepad. And then I could pass that to a stop process to kill them. So it really is a very, very powerful environment. And I can do a lot of things on one line. You can see this is a single command I created here that would have moved all the VM storage for all the VMs on that box whose hard drives were in a certain path. But I can also create entire scripts, and that's what we're going to cover next. So this concludes the more advanced lesson on some of our capabilities with PowerShell related to piping objects and our what if testing.